Rome was an empire built on power, ambition, and absolute control. But beneath its marble palaces and triumphal arches, a darker truth lurked. Male concubines, slaves forced into servitude, lived lives of luxury wrapped in chains. They were paraded as symbols of dominance, trapped in gilded cages where every smile was an act of survival. Behind the curtain of Roman grandeur was a world of humiliation, manipulation, and unspoken suffering. This isn't the story told in schoolbooks. It's the hidden nightmare of those who were never allowed to speak for themselves. Welcome to the horrific life of male concubines in the Roman Empire. Male concubines in Rome came from many paths, but none of them chosen. Some were prisoners of war, captured soldiers stripped of rank and dignity, sold like cattle in the slave markets. Others were young men traded by desperate families for survival or seized by corrupt officials who saw them as commodities. Once taken, they belonged to their masters entirely. No legal rights, no hope of protection. For the Roman elite, they were ornaments, living symbols of wealth and power. But behind every lavish tunic and polished appearance was a man who had lost his freedom. And worse, their lives were shaped not just by obedience, but by fear of the consequences if they failed to please. Their identity was erased, replaced by a role they were forced to play until their very will broke. On the surface, life in a Roman palace might have seemed like a dream. Concubines dined on food finer than most soldiers could imagine. They slept on silk cushions and walked marble floors polished until they gleamed. But these luxuries were nothing more than gilded shackles. Every movement was watched by guards and attendants. Every word was weighed. A single mistake, a wrong look, a delayed response, could result in punishment or worse. They lived in an invisible prison, one where walls weren't made of stone, but of power. For many concubines, the greatest cruelty wasn't the loss of freedom. It was the constant performance. They were expected to smile, flatter, and obey, even while their souls withered in silence. A palace might have been a place of splendor, but for them, it was nothing but a beautiful cage. Behind the closed doors of Rome's grandest estates, punishment was a constant shadow. Concubines who disobeyed or displeased their masters faced harsh consequences. Some were beaten, confined to dark cells beneath the palaces, or paraded in humiliation before others as a warning. Rome was a society built on dominance, and its elite wielded power like a weapon. Concubines had no law to protect them. Every command was absolute, every punishment final. To survive, they learned to read their master's moods, to anticipate every whim before it was voiced. But no amount of caution could erase the fear. For every lavish feast and silken robe, there was a reminder. Disobedience didn't just cost comfort, it could cost your life. In Rome, concubines weren't simply companions, they were political tools. Senators and generals flaunted their concubines as a sign of influence, each one more beautiful or exotic than the last. To own the finest concubine wasn't just indulgence, it was a public declaration of dominance over rivals. Some concubines became pawns in schemes they barely understood, traded between powerful masters as if they were nothing more than gifts. Their value was measured not by their humanity, but by the prestige they brought. Even emperors joined this brutal display of ownership. For the elite, every concubine was a conquest that spoke louder than any legion ever could. And for the men trapped in that world, there was no escape. Only a life spent as a living prize in someone else's game. Obedience was survival, and survival meant surrender. Concubines became masters of performance, crafting false smiles and perfect manners. They learned how to move without drawing anger, how to speak only when spoken to, and how to hide the pieces of themselves that once made them human. Over time, many forgot what it was like to choose anything at all. The cost of their obedience was their identity, traded away in exchange for another day of life. Yet even in this nightmare, some clung to fragments of hope, whispers of freedom, rumors of sympathetic masters, or dreams of escape. But in the heart of Rome, hope was a dangerous thing, and for most concubines, it was a luxury they couldn't afford. In the midst of cruelty, forbidden love sometimes bloomed in the shadows. Some concubines formed secret bonds with one another or with sympathetic servants, creating quiet rebellions against the empire's chains. But such love was dangerous. Discovery meant punishment, sometimes exile, sometimes death. Yet for many, those fleeting moments of stolen affection were the only proof they were still alive. A single touch, a whispered word in the dark. It was enough to remind them that they were more than property, more than trophies of Rome's power. But like everything in their world, love was a risk. And in the palaces of emperors and senators, risks were rarely forgiven. Power in Rome wasn't just enforced behind closed doors. It was displayed. Some masters used their concubines for public humiliation, forcing them to appear in gatherings not as people, but as possessions. They were dressed in extravagant clothing, paraded before guests like exotic animals, and made to serve as symbols of absolute control. For many, these moments were worse than private punishment. Every laugh, every whisper from the watching elite drove the dagger deeper. There was no dignity left, only the bitter knowledge that escape was impossible. The humiliation didn't just break the body, it broke the spirit. For concubines, survival became an art of endurance, and every step taken in the view of others was a silent scream that no one was allowed to hear. For those who dared to resist, the cost was unbearable. A concubine who defied his master could be flogged, starved, or cast out into a world where survival was nearly impossible. Some were sent to the mines, an unspoken death sentence. Others were publicly beaten as an example to ensure no one else would dare to challenge their place. Defiance was more than rebellion. It was suicide. And yet, every so often, a man chose pride over survival, refusing to bend to Rome's cruel hierarchy. These rare acts of courage were quickly silenced, erased from history. The empire didn't just conquer nations, it conquered the very will of those trapped within it. In Rome, obedience was the only path to life, and defiance was the fastest road to death. Life under the emperor was both the highest honor and the greatest nightmare. The imperial concubines lived in unimaginable luxury: golden plates, jeweled clothing, and endless banquets. But in return, they endured a level of control that was suffocating. Every hour was scheduled, every word monitored by servants and guards. The emperor's favor was a gift, but it was also a curse. A single slip, even a minor one, could mean exile or execution. To be the property of Rome's most powerful man was to live in constant fear disguised as privilege. Behind the marble walls of the imperial palace, the concubines of the emperor learned a cruel truth. The closer you were to power, the less control you truly had. Even in a society that thrived on dominance and hierarchy, male concubines carried a unique stigma. They weren't seen as victims. They were viewed as weak, tainted, and dishonored. Soldiers mocked them, servants pitted them, and the elite who owned them rarely spoke of them, except as objects of possession. This cruel perception stripped concubines of their humanity, ensuring that even if freedom ever came, they would remain marked by shame. To the Romans, they weren't men. They weren't even individuals. They were property, and property had no story worth telling. This societal cruelty was perhaps the deepest wound of all, because it ensured that even if their chains broke, they would never truly escape Rome's grasp. To maintain control, Rome employed enforcers, guards, overseers, and administrators who made sure the concubines never stepped out of line. These men were feared more than the masters themselves. They delivered punishments, monitored every interaction, and reminded concubines of their place with ruthless efficiency. Many concubines learned to fear the sound of their footsteps in the halls. It meant another order, another punishment, or another reminder that their lives were not their own. Enforcers didn't see them as men. They were tools, and like tools, they were used until they broke. Rome didn't simply build walls around its palaces. It built a living system of control that made escape impossible. Rome didn't just use chains to keep its concubines in line, it used a mind. Masters employed psychological tactics to strip away any thought of rebellion. They offered small rewards to encourage obedience, then took them away to enforce submission. Concubines were told they were lucky, that life outside the palace would be worse, that their suffering was a privilege. Over time, many believed it. Rome didn't just enslave their bodies, it rewrote their minds. This was the most insidious cruelty of all, because it turned prisoners into willing captives. And by the time most concubines realized the truth, it was too late. Their will to resist was gone, smothered by Rome's relentless control. Some concubines tried to run. Desperation drove them to scale palace walls, hide in supply carts, or flee under the cover of night. But Rome was an empire built on order, and order had no mercy. Those who were caught faced brutal punishment, branding, mutilation, or public execution meant to terrify the others into compliance. These failed escapes became cautionary tales whispered in the dark, reminders that even hope was dangerous. The Roman elite didn't just crush rebellions. They turned them into lessons, ensuring no concubine ever forgot the cost of dreaming too loudly. Sometimes fortune shifted. A master might fall from grace, stripped of wealth and power by political rivals. For a brief moment, the concubines held their breath, hoping for freedom. But in Rome, downfall didn't bring liberation. It only meant a change in ownership. Concubines were traded like property, passed from one master to the next, their lives rearranged by politics they could never control. The empire ensured that no matter what happened to their captors, the chains around their necks never truly loosened. Rome had built a system where even the fall of the mighty was no escape for the powerless. Though open rebellion was suicide, concubines sometimes fought back in quiet ways. Small acts of defiance became their only weapons, breaking expensive dishes, refusing to speak, or subtly sabotaging their master's possessions. These weren't the grand revolts of history. They were tiny sparks of resistance in a world designed to crush them. Even these acts carried risks. A single mistake could lead to severe punishment. But for the concubines, these rebellions were proof that Rome hadn't taken everything. In a world where their bodies belonged to others, these little victories were the only thing they truly owned. Though history never recorded their names, these silent revolts were the echoes of dignity in a system built on absolute control. Every now and then, a concubine's story ended differently. Some earned their master's favor, receiving manumission, the legal right to be freed. But this so-called freedom was complicated. Though they were no longer property, many carried the weight of stigma, marked forever by their past. Some stayed in service to their former masters, bound by loyalty, fear, or lack of alternatives. Others disappeared into Rome's crowded streets, vanishing into obscurity. Freedom was a fragile dream in the Roman Empire. Even when granted, it came with invisible chains of shame and survival. For many, liberty was not a triumph. It was simply another form of endurance. To understand the life of male concubines is to see Rome for what it truly was, a machine. This machine didn't run on marble or gold. It ran on human lives. Soldiers conquered, officials administered, and concubines endured. The empire's brilliance came at a cost hidden behind palace walls. The suffering of these men was not an accident. It was a feature of Rome's unrelenting hunger for power. From the poorest servant to the most pampered imperial concubine, they were all cogs in a system designed to crush individuality. And yet, within that machinery, some small part of the human spirit always fought to survive. The greatest wound of all was not physical, it was emotional. Living as a concubine meant waking up every day knowing your life wasn't your own. Friendships were rare, trust was dangerous, and dreams were a luxury few could afford. Some concubines clung to small rituals. Secret conversations in shadowed halls, a quiet look shared between captives to remind themselves they were still human. But for many, The weight of constant fear and humiliation erased their sense of self. Rome didn't just dominate their bodies, it hollowed out their souls. And in the silence of its palaces, countless men became ghosts, forgotten even before they died. Though their names are lost, their legacy remains hidden in the cracks of history. Concubines shaped Rome in ways few will ever know. They were silent witnesses to imperial secrets, political plots, and the private lives of emperors. They existed in the shadows of power, unseen but ever present. Without them, Rome's palaces would not have functioned. Yet, history rarely writes about the voiceless. These men became ghosts in the record, proof of how empires rise on the backs of those who never get to speak. The story of male concubines in Rome isn't one of power or glory. It's one of survival. It's a story Rome tried to bury, one it never wanted told. Behind the splendor of the empire was a world of quiet suffering, lived out by those whose only mistake was being at the mercy of the most powerful civilization on earth. They may not have left monuments or written their names into history, but their endurance tells us everything about the cost of Rome's greatness. The empire was built not just with armies, but with the lives it consumed. If you think this was the darkest part of Rome's history, it wasn't. There are even more disturbing truths hidden in its shadows. Subscribe, and we'll uncover the secrets the history books never dare to tell. Because Rome wasn't just an empire, it was a machine that devoured lives.